That's Razor.
That's Big Daddy Cool Diesel.
But who's that? That's you, Triple H. Wait a minute. Hey,
What is this?
you were a bad guy. I was a good guy.
We're good guys.
Welcome to another edition of This Day in History here on the GoodMicWork channel. Today, May 19th, 2016, marks the 20-year anniversary of one of the most history-making and significant incidents ever to take place in the history of professional wrestling, in my opinion. And that's what we're here to talk about today, the Curtain Call. I am no stranger to talking about the Curtain Call. You guys have heard me discuss this many times over the years, probably half a dozen times at least. I know I've talked about the Curtain Call in Q&As. I know I talked about it in Triple H's DVD review that I did about a year or so ago. I have spent a lot of time talking about this, but I figured I would talk about it a little bit more because 20 years is amazing. I remember these days like it was yesterday. This time period in wrestling holds a special place in my wrestling memory and my wrestling heart. And 1996 was a year that I basically remember everything about. And this Curtain Call incident was extremely controversial, and we're going to talk about the consequences of it and what it led to and how it affected the business. And I think this night in Madison Square Garden, this house show led to some of the biggest angles and storylines and stars this business has ever seen, namely Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold Steve Austin was very lucky in his career. Between this Curtain Call incident and the Montreal Screwjob that would happen about a year and a half later that birthed the Vince McMahon heel character to go up against Stone Cold, between those two incidents, Austin owes his career to those two nights, that's for sure. But the Curtain Call, for those of you who don't know, just to set the stage for you, back in the day in 1996, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were lured away from WWE by WCW. They were two of the top 5 guys in the company. Back in 1996, your top 5 wrestlers were Brett, Shawn, Taker, Razor, and Diesel. And Razor and Diesel were taking off. These were two megastars in the WWE, and they had also now made the jump over to WCW, seemingly decimating the WWE's roster. They did it purely for the money. WCW offered them a better schedule and a hell of a lot more money than Vince McMahon. Both guys, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, say to this day that they never really wanted to leave. They loved the WWE. They knew that WCW was a joke. They were both there earlier on in their careers before coming to the WWE, and their careers were garbage. So going back there frightened them from a creative standpoint, but financially, there was no way they could say no. I mean, WCW was paying them a ridiculous sum of money. Plus, they had all these clauses in their contracts that would allow them to be the highest paid in the company. So if somebody came in and got a bigger contract than them, they were immediately bumped up to that amount as well. So you can't blame these guys for leaving. They, of course, were very good friends, along with Shawn Michaels and Triple H and X-Pac. They were known backstage as the Kliq, and they had a lot of power in the WWE. They would call meetings with Vince McMahon if things weren't going their way. They had a lot of stroke. They had a lot of influence. And they were really unliked by a lot of the locker room. Even though I've always been a Kliq defender, I'm not going to deny that maybe Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Shawn Michaels might have stepped on a few throats in their careers, but that's the business. That's the name of the game. If it wasn't them doing it, it would be somebody else. So even though I can fully admit that these guys, I'm sure, were dicks from time to time, they were just doing what they had to do to get over and be a big player in the business, and you cannot fault them for that. Anybody else in their position probably would have behaved the same way. A lot of them had other issues as well. This was during the drug era of the WWE, so they were all fucked up on pills constantly. They drank a lot, and they had a good time. They partied. They lived the life. Some of them lived it a little harder than others. Scott Hall damn near died from his substance abuse. X-Pac came damn close as well. Shawn Michaels got himself cleaned up. Triple H really never drank at all. And Kevin Nash just had his head screwed on straight. Even though he partook in the fun and did his share of partying, he never let it get the best of him, and he still maintained a marriage and a family life and remained responsible. So I've always respected Kevin Nash for that. But the Kliq was, like I said, was really kind of disliked, and they had a lot of heat in the locker room. So what took place on this night in Madison Square Garden only added fuel to that fire. So like I said, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were heading off to WCW. They had given their notice. They'd basically just have to finish out working their schedule. Kevin Nash worked WrestleMania and lost to The Undertaker, and then he lost to Shawn Michaels, and Shawn Michaels' very first title defense at that In Your House right after WrestleMania, Good Friends, Better Enemies, one of my favorite, probably my favorite Diesel match of all time. That was an awesome hardcore match between him and Shawn. Razor was suspended for most of the beginning of 1996, but came back to work that In Your House pay-per-view as well and lost to Vader, and then he would job out on house shows until they left. And it just so happened that their final night in the company was at Madison Square Garden on May 19th, 1996. Razor Ramon would take on Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, who was a relative newcomer to the WWE but had fallen into that Kliq group, and he was friends with them. And then, of course, Shawn Michaels was going to be taking on Diesel in a cage match in the main event for the WWE title. Madison Square Garden in New York City has always been considered a very smart town. The fans there are a little bit more aware, especially from a behind-the-scenes perspective, than fans in other parts of the country, especially back then. Maybe not now. Now every town is a smart town. But back then, New York was really one of those only places where the fans really knew what was going on. So the entire arena that night knew that it was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's last night. I think they were chanting sellouts at both of them throughout the show. So the fans definitely knew what was going on. I knew what was going on because I was calling wrestling hotlines and I was subscribed to some dirt sheets and shit. So I knew that Hall and Nash were on their way out as well. But what made this night so controversial is that earlier on, Triple H defeated Razor Ramon, and that was Razor's last match in the company. And then in the main event, Shawn Michaels, of course, beats Diesel in the cage match. Now, the story goes, and there's a lot of different versions of this, but most of the Kliq guys will tell you that they did approach Vince and ask him if it would be okay if they did a little something after the main event. I think the story is most likely the fact that they just didn't give him enough information. They might have said, hey, we want to go out in the aisleway, or we want to do a quick handshake, or salute each other, or something. But they went out there and basically had an orgy in the middle of the ring. And a lot of the old-timers were pissed off, especially the fact that Triple H was a heel, and Kevin Nash was a heel, and you had Razor Ramon come down to the ring first after Kevin Nash and Shawn had their match. He kind of does the Kliq symbol with Shawn, and then they hug, and then the three of them embrace, and then here comes Triple H, which, you know, the guys that were recording the footage, you could hear them screaming like, holy shit, Triple H, you know, because that was pretty weird. I mean, a lot of people knew that Shawn and Razor and Diesel were friends because they had matches together and teamed up with each other in the past. Shawn Michaels had had that great series of ladder matches with Scott Hall. They had been on the same side of a babyface tag team a time or two as well, so it wasn't uncommon to see these guys interact, but when you saw Triple H come out there and hug them, it was like, holy fuck. And when you watch the crowd in that really shaky fan cam footage, the only footage of this incident that exists, you can hear the crowd going ape shit over this. I mean, they were popping so hard. Where meanwhile, backstage, all the old timers, Jim Cornette and Bruce Pritchard and Gerald Briscoe and guys like that, they were throwing shit around and kicking crap and yelling and screaming and freaking out like the entire wrestling business had just exploded before their very eyes. And from a traditional standpoint, I understand that that's something that you don't do. You know, that's extremely taboo. You know, you can be ousted and blackballed from wrestling for doing something like that in the old days. But now it's 1996. If this would have been the 80s, if this would have been the 70s, those guys could have gotten their legs broken for doing shit like that. But nowadays, fans are starting to know, and the cat was already out of the bag by 1996. Not quite all the way out, but fans for the most part knew. Where I disagree with the old-timers is that if you look at the crowd and the way they were going nuts over it, you know, and then the guys backstage were pissed off that the crowd is excited and happy and enjoying what they're seeing. That's ridiculous. I know it was kind of against the script. I know that Vince really wasn't fully aware of what these guys had planned, but it was hardly the worst thing in the world because the fans were eating it up. I mean, the show was over, and none of the fans left. They stayed there and watched these guys celebrate and hug in the ring. They all climbed up to each corner of the cage and saluted the audience and did a big hug. I mean, there was fans in the audience crying over this. I mean, it was a pretty big deal, and I thought it was a nice moment. You know, yeah, it definitely broke kayfabe. Yeah, it pulled back the curtain, but to me, it was already pulled back by this point. And it would only be, what, a year later? That they would show this footage on the Titantron on Monday Night Raw, maybe a year and a half later. It was the night after Bad Blood in October of 1997, and I opened the commentary with that. One of my favorite lines in WWE is when they're playing the curtain call on Titantron, and Triple H and Shawn are in the ring saying, wait a minute, you were a good guy, and you were a bad guy, and what are you doing together? And kind of making a joke out of the whole thing, which I liked. So if you look at the way the WWE went, it was only a year and a half later they were playing the shit on the Titantron for their own fans on Monday Night Raw on television. So to act like what they did was the worst thing in the world is horseshit because they used it in an angle 18 months later. It's ridiculous. So I thought that the anger and the hate and the heat that everybody got was a little bit unnecessary. And of course, we all know the story of what happened to Triple H because of this incident. The story is that Shawn was the champion. So how can you punish Shawn? How can you have him job out when he's the WWE champion? You also cannot punish Kevin Nash and Scott Hall because they're gone. Their contract is up. They're going to be on Nitro in a week. So that only left one guy, Triple H, who was only a mid-carder at the time anyway, and he damn near got fired for that incident, and he had to take all the heat. He had to go and apologize to everybody. He had to job out and get humiliated in matches. Not that that wasn't already happening. You know, the WWE likes to make you think that the loss to the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania and the hog pen match with Henry Godwin was a result of the curtain call. It wasn't. All that shit took place before the curtain call. Basically, Triple H just had to spend his whole entire summer losing every match he competed in. And then just a couple of months later, you know, this took place in May. By October, he was Intercontinental Champion. So Triple H's punishment didn't last very long. It only lasted a few months. But the biggest thing that happened to him was the fact that they took away the King of the Ring. He was supposed to win the King of the Ring in 1996. And they said, you're not going to win that now. You're going to lose in the first round, and we're going to put the crown on Stone Cold Steve Austin. We all know how that worked out. Had it not been for this curtain call, we would have never got that Austin 316 promo that Austin cut on Jake the Snake Roberts. That would have never happened. Stone Cold, I think, still could have made it to superstar level without that promo, but you would have never had those Austin 316 shirts, and you never know how high he would have gotten without that initial King of the Ring 1996 promo. So Austin could potentially owe his career to the Kliq, if you think about it. So that was a big moment. So that was probably the biggest thing, I think, to come out of the curtain call. And when you look back, thank God the curtain call happened. I would have much preferred seeing Stone Cold win the King of the Ring than Triple H at that time. A year later, Triple H would win the King of the Ring, and that might have been the better time anyway. So they were trying to make Triple H as a new top heel since they were losing Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, but that was taken away from him, and he had to lose all summer long, and that birthed Stone Cold Steve Austin, and the rest, as they say, is history as far as Austin goes. But the curtain call itself, I have no ill feelings towards any of those guys. I mean, there is part of me that understands from a traditional sense, and the fact that I'm an old school guy, I completely understand why some old timers would be upset by that, because it really is truly something that you just do not do. But from a fan's perspective, and the way the business was changing, and the way that fans were becoming more aware of what's going on, I mean, hell, look at where we are today. Now the WWE openly admits, constantly, on a constant basis, that everything is scripted. They break kayfabe every 5 minutes. Every single WWE DVD is just people talking about how the fact that it's all a story. So in the last 20 years, we've come a long way. So times changed very, very quickly. And shortly after this curtain call took place, stuff like that didn't matter anymore. You know, the rule book was thrown out the window. WWE said, all right, we gotta buckle down and go to the extreme if we want to compete with WCW. Otherwise, we're going to be out of business. So they embraced all of that. They embraced letting the fans in on some of the secrets in professional wrestling. They embraced talking about the curtain call and talking about WCW and, really making this war public. And I think looking back at the curtain call, there's no way that curtain call hurt the business. If anything, it helped the business. And it really solidified the power of the Kliq. I mean, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were now leaving. They were going down to WCW, and they would dominate. I almost thought about making this day in history episode about Scott Hall's debut on Monday Nitro, which would take place just a week later on May 27th. And then 2 months after that, at Bash at the Beach, we had the birth of the NWO. So both of those things are coming up on their 20-year anniversary as well. But the curtain call is what led to all of it. The curtain call is what started it all. You know, having Scott Hall and Kevin Nash go over to WCW with the fans now knowing about the curtain call, the smart fans, that is, the ones that were reading the dirt sheets and shit like that, like I was, for them to go over to WCW now, you know, you say to yourself, wow, you know, Scott and Kevin are in one company dominating, and Shawn and Triple H are in the other company dominating. That's an amazing sense of accomplishment and pride, I would think, for a group of friends like that. I mean, they literally did what they had to do to be major influences in this business, and every single one of them made their mark, and every single one of them are bona fide Hall of Famers. You would see the interaction between the Kliq members on Raw and Nitro. I remember Shawn flashed the Kliq symbol on WrestleMania 13 when he came down to the aisle to do commentary. And then the very next night on Nitro, Kevin Nash comes down in the aisle, and right in the camera, he does the Kliq sign, and he goes, right back at you, HBK. I mean, it was little things like that that fans like myself noticed that was so awesome, because it was just something you had not seen before, and you had not seen this camaraderie, and you had not seen a group of friends split up working for competing organizations, you know, but remaining close at the same time. And that was extremely rare and really cool and really unique for that time period. I'm so happy that here we are 20 years ago to the day, and all of these guys are still alive. I know X-Pac was not involved in the curtain call that night, but he's another Kliq member that had some problems throughout the years. We all know what Scott Hall went through, and the fact that he found DDP and found some direction in his life, and he seems like he's back to normal, sort of. I'm sure he's done a hell of a lot of damage to his body and shit like that, but to see him clean and sober and doing interviews for the WWE and making appearances and being put in the Hall of Fame, I think that's awesome, because Scott Hall could easily be dead right now. X-Pac could easily be dead right now. The Kliq could have a very tragic end, but instead I think it has a happy ending. I mean, just a couple of years ago when they put in Scott Hall and Kevin Nash into the Hall of Fame, you had the whole Kliq out there together as one, just like they were 20 years ago. And to see them all now as old men, you know, still alive and still being friends and still being able to reminisce with each other about how awesome those days were. As a matter of fact, I just saw the WWE Network. I think the latest Table for Three is Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and X-Pac. And I have yet to watch that, but I'm sure that's very interesting. So I'm happy for those guys. I'm proud of all of them. I mean, they all made it to extraordinary heights in the business. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash made record money in WCW. Shawn Michaels, of course, was the Michael Jordan of wrestling, quite possibly the greatest in-ring worker we have ever seen. Triple H, who was the mid-carder and the low man on the totem pole in that Kliq, turned out to be the next owner of the fucking WWE. So the Kliq has their footprint and their fingerprints on professional wrestling until the end of time, for the most part. This curtain call kicked off, in my life, what was one of the most memorable professional wrestling summers of my life. I just did my Q&A and uploaded it like yesterday, and I was telling a whole bunch of wrestler interaction stories, and one of those is when I was backstage at a WWE house show in 1996, just 2 months after this incident had taken place. And I remember being back home in North Carolina, living in the apartment that I had, and it had like a window unit, air conditioning, and I remember watching Nitro and Raw and flipping back and forth and watching the NWO wreak havoc on WCW at the Disney Resort when they were holding Nitros there, and I just remember the feel of it. I remember those hot, thick, humid summer nights with my window unit AC cranking hardcore on a Monday night, watching Raw and Nitro and watching the Kliq do their thing. I mean, I really enjoyed the summer of 1996. It was great. It was a fabulous time to be a wrestling fan, and I remember it so fondly. And I'm shocked that it's been 20 years already since all that took place. I am getting fucking old. So all in all, the Kliq is a very controversial topic in wrestling. A lot of fans can't stand the way they did things, hate Triple H for what he did, hate Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall. I don't look at it that way. I look at all those guys as relatively cool dudes. You know, when you see them all, or if you meet them personally, or you hear them in interviews, they don't sound like assholes. They don't sound like greedy, stuck-up, egotistical pricks. You know, they're pretty much regular guys that just did what they had to do for their family. I've said time and time again that one of my ultimate dreams is just to sit down with a bottle of red wine with Kevin Nash and talk about the business. Maybe light up a joint or something too. Seems like a really fun, down-to-earth guy and a regular dude. And that's what I like about the Kliq. Yeah, they threw their weight around a little bit, and yeah, they did what they had to do to keep themselves on top, but like I said, that's what anybody would do. And I think what they did and their story and the mark they made on wrestling is enormous. The only guys left to go into the Hall of Fame now are Triple H and X-Pac. X-Pac's a little iffy. I don't know if they'll put him in or not. He can definitely go in as part of the NWO or as part of D-Generation X, whether or not he goes in by himself. I mean, Triple H is the one that said on Stone Cold's podcast that he didn't want Chyna to go in because he didn't want his kids Googling her name. Well, they could Google X-Pac's name too, you know. So by that logic, I'm not sure when they will put Sean Waltman in, if at all. But for the most part, I still think that every Kliq member is Hall of Fame worthy. So here's a salute and a toast to 20 years of friendship between the Kliq. You guys are awesome. Congrats on all of your runs and all your success in professional wrestling. So let me know all your opinions on this, on the curtain call and the Kliq, on some of the stories and the influence that they had in professional wrestling. I'd love to get a vote from some of you to see if you agree with me or not, because I do know that the Kliq is not as loved by the fans as they are by me. So I'll read the comments in a couple days and try to gauge how you guys all feel about the Kliq. But 20 years is a long time, and it's a pretty remarkable anniversary for an incident in wrestling that is still just as memorable as the day it happened. So long live the Kliq, and I hope to join you again really soon for another This Day in History. Until then, peace.